So the first thing we're going to want to do is add in a circle object. And then over here in the properties, we can change that to 7, 6, 8, however many you want to add in. I usually like 7. Just change that so it has 7 sides. And then we're actually going to turn this into our web. So first thing, we're going to go into edit mode, and then we extrude upwards. And we're going to scale this part down. And then we're going to extend upwards from that as well. So we're just basically getting the mesh of our web figured out right now. So we're going to go ahead and extrude upwards again. Shrink it down a little bit first, and we'll extrude upwards. You don't actually need to make it as long as I make it in this part, but I just made it nice and long. You can, all of this is to taste. You don't have to follow exact measurements with how I scale everything up here. Now, to make this look more like a web, we're going to select these edge loops, and then we're actually going to bevel it to give it a nicer curve. You can use the scroll wheel to add a few more edges, and then we can just do that. So that's looking good. And then the secret sauce, the secret step to making this look a little bit more like a web is we're actually going to hit K to go into the knife tool, and we're just going to make slices. So you can do kind of slices like I did where they're straight up, and then if you want to add even more geometry, you can just swing it back and forth holding the mouse down. However you want to do it, I usually find that adding more cuts tends to look more like a web, but again, this is all personal preference. So you can go through. Sometimes the ones on the sides don't get as many straight up and down lines, so you can go through and just add some of those if you need to. But yeah, so that's what I'm doing right here. And we're just gonna go over again to the other side and cut it all up again. Now, we are actually going to, after finishing up all of these edits, the plan is to put on a wireframe modifier eventually. So all of these edges are basically going to become like the webs. And a thing that I like to do, just to make this look even more web-like, is to make sure that we add some loop cuts to the long section, because when it goes into wireframe, we're actually going to need some more geometry to work with here. And so I just add some loop cuts. You can add a bunch. You probably don't need to add as many as I do in this part. But yeah, you can add maybe somewhere around 200, 300 cuts. Depending on how tall your web is, you can add more or less, whichever number seems best to you. But I think I ended up with about 300 cuts on this. And now we're actually going to subdivide this if you want to. You can kind of see how it starts creating some grid patterns and giving that some more web-like qualities. And then sculpt mode is going to help us do a little bit of beautifying of this web, just make it look a little bit more organic. And we're just going to use the smoothing tool and actually just smooth out some of that. So let me go into wireframe mode here, and so you can see a little bit what's happening. Some of those grid pieces actually kind of make these cool circular patterns, and to me it just looks a lot more like a spider web. So we're basically just going to go through and smooth out every side on its own. I'm going to speed up this process here. We don't need to see every last second, so skip to the end. That's just after I had sculpted and smoothed out all those edges, and it's looking really nice. Okay, so now looking good. We're actually going to put on the wireframe modifier so we can see what our web is looking like. You can just go to wireframe modifier. Where is it? There it is. Go to wireframe, and then I uncheck even, because for some reason if you have the even box checked, it makes all these weird webs that kind of go out, lines that shoot out in different directions. So uncheck even, and then this is where you can decide with the thickness. So the normal, the kind of the default, like the 0.02 is usually okay for webs. If you need it to be thinner, then that's okay. Actually, sometimes I like it a little bit thicker, because if it's too thin, it might not show up very well on your video when you integrate it. In this part, we're actually just going to do a little bit more shaping to give it some more organic feel, because right now it feels really really even, really symmetrical. So we kind of want to extend out some of these pieces. Again, these are optional steps. You can take this as far as you want to and sculpt the whole web. In this, I just kind of gave it, extended out the points a little bit and kind of pulled in the center between the points, so that you could kind of get that more organic look that you sometimes see with Spider-Man effect. So just speeding through that. I think I actually even zoomed out and went a little bit more, yeah. So more on this end is usually better. You don't really want it to look too symmetrical, because then it kind of takes away from the whole point of, you know, being a spider web that's shot out of a web shooter. But I think this is looking pretty good. So we can go into the next step of the process, which is actually, if you want to, you can delete some of the faces. We haven't applied the modifier yet, so we're going to delete some of the faces down below and actually make it so it's not just a full-on polygon, seven-sided shape on the bottom. So you can kind of delete some of the faces here. I actually went around, and I skipped through this process, but I actually went around and created some cuts down the sides, so that we still get the long lines that can connect to whatever we're shooting at in this case. And yeah, so I went through and did that process just to give it, again, a more organic feel, and then you can smooth that out, and that's looking pretty nice. So yeah, this is the process that I've kind of come up with for actually making the mesh of the web. You can experiment as much as you want to. These aren't obviously set rules, so just make it however looks most realistic or best to you, or whatever suits the project that you're working on. So now I'm actually going to scale it down a little bit on the z-axis, just because it is a little bit tall. And now we're actually going to make the cage that surrounds the web, so that way we'll be able to animate the actual web. And this is a pretty straightforward process. I experimented with a lot of different kinds of animation. I tried rigging it with bones. I tried doing lattice objects. The best thing I could find was actually just called the mesh deform modifier. So we're gonna make this box so we just see it as a wireframe, and so it doesn't get in the way. We can see a little bit clearer. And I also unchecked the visibility in the render viewport, so that we won't be actually seeing it when we integrate it into the live action footage. So right here, just doing some last adjustments to the actual cage, so it actually fits the mesh a little bit better. And yeah, so we're gonna actually end up making some cuts at the ends and in the middle of the model, just some loop cuts, and those are actually gonna be the pivot points that we animate the mesh on. So for right now, I'm just getting the shape, the overall shape of the web a little more dialed in, and so now we're gonna add in these loop cuts that will help in the animation process. So I usually like to put at least one loop cut down near the end of the cage, preferably two, so that way when we actually animate the bottom of the web doesn't, it has more priority on the end of the web. So when we move these pieces, and if we're moving pieces further back in the cage, then the front of the web isn't going to get pulled off of the wall that we're shooting it at, if that makes sense. So even if that didn't make sense, it's usually best to add at least one or two loop cuts at the bottom, and that will make a little bit more sense later on. So select those loops, and it's looking good. Through this process, I was just editing it, so the loop cuts were kind of close to the end, but not exactly on the bottom part of the cage that we're working with. So we're gonna add a couple more loop cuts. 2 should be enough, but if you want to, you can do 3. In this case, I believe I went with 3 loop cuts. Yep. So I had a 3rd loop cut there. And the one that's closer to the head of the web, the thick section, is actually so that we can kind of shape the cage even a little bit more. I don't think that's a necessary part of the process, but it does help to kind of visualize the web as the cage looks a little bit more to the right shape of the web in the end. So this is the process of actually creating something that we can animate, so we don't have to animate every individual vertex of every individual vertex of the web object. So if we hook certain sections of the mesh to new objects, you can do that in the vertex menu, or you can do, I believe the command is Control H. Then you can actually hook each of these objects to new empties, and then all we have to do after that is actually just move the empties and animate them, and the mesh will move with it. But as you can see here, the web doesn't deform with the cage, even though the cage is deforming properly. So that's where the mesh deform modifier is going to come in handy. So we can apply the wireframe. I don't think that's going to be an issue, so we can leave it if we want to. I haven't done a lot of experimenting with leaving that, but it should be okay either way. So now we're just going to make the circle. I went back and renamed all of the objects so that we can understand a little bit more which one and select them. So with the empties, I just named one of them start and one of them end. The web is web, and then the cage is just cage. Again, optional process. You don't have to do it, but I think it works to help organize your workspace a little bit better so you don't get confused about what you're selecting and all of these things. Okay, so now we're going to put this modifier. Binding it just means that now the web is bound to the cage object. And if we move it, then we should see some nice deformation. It's kind of hard to see from zoomed out, but the web is actually deforming and it's looking good. So now we have our web object and it should be parented to the cage. Okay, in this case, we're seeing a weird error where some of the web pieces aren't actually moving with the cage. And in this instance, it was just because the cage wasn't actually big enough to cover all of the objects. You can kind of see how some of it is actually extending beyond the cage that I made. So I just had to go back and actually fix the boundaries of the cage. So if you need to do that process, you just unbind it, and then you can go into edit mode and actually just expand the size of the cage so that the web fits inside, and then that error should be fixed. And in this case it was. I had never run into this error because I usually gave it a generous amount of space between the cage and the actual web object. So this was the first time I was seeing it, but it's good because if anyone else has that issue, then there's the answer of how to fix it. So now it's looking good. Oh, I missed one more. So again, same process. I just needed to expand the cage a little bit more and get those last few vertices inside of the cage, and the error was fixed. Okay, looks like I forgot to unbind the object, so even in edit mode, it was actually just making the model move. So you have to remember to unbind it before you make adjustments, otherwise the web is actually going to continue deforming with the cage. So unbind, and then adjust the size of the cage. Perfect. Well, there you have it. That's our web. It should work now with no issues. And yeah, so kind of the idea of making a web in 3D like this, actually physically 3D modeling the web, isn't how movies would normally tend to do this. Usually you would be seeing something like a geometry node setup that actually makes it procedural, or some other process. They might actually be simulating it. In my case, I found that it's actually just easier not to simulate and create this animatable object. So I hope that that was easy enough to follow. This isn't necessarily a full-on beginner tutorial, but it should help for anyone who's looking to make their own. And the nice part about this process is that you can totally just use this model in any project. You can append it to any other projects. So once you make one of them, you really don't have to make one every single time that you do a new project. So you just save this project file. It's low poly, so it's not going to be an issue with with your visual effects scenes, and you can use it in any other shots. So stay tuned for part 2, where we're going to be talking about how to actually animate this and integrate it into the visual effects shot. Anyways, thanks you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.